guys, it's Ryan. Thanks for tuning into Theology-ish. Before we jump in, I just want to emphasize that the discussions on this podcast are exploratory in nature and do not strictly represent or define our personal stances on the faith, nor the doctrine of our affiliated churches. We encourage listeners to reflect, question, and seek guidance from their local church leaders. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Theology-ish, your favorite podcast about all things theology related and adjacent. My name is Ryan, and I am joined today, as always, by William.
Hi, that's me, William, the other one.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
How's it going?
Pretty good. How about you?
Going pretty good.
Good.
No, what time is it?
It is 9:30.
Yeah, I woke up like 2 hours ago. Got my coffee. Feeling pretty good.
Same. Had some donuts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Apple fritter.
How'd you like it?
It's pretty good.
Good.
Yeah, what's new with you?
Oh, same things since the last time you asked me an hour ago.
That's...
We record multiple episodes at a time, so, it's the same stuff.
What are your thoughts on the current geopolitical state of the United States of America in relation to other countries?
Anyway, we're going to talk about something less contentious today, the Bible.
I'm not so sure about that one.
Well, regardless. Ryan,
Yeah.
you ever talk to someone who's not a fan of the Bible or
Nope.
Christianity in
Never.
general? No? Never? Okay. Well, if you do...
Everyone I've ever met is a devout-based Christian.
Man, I wish. But hypothetically,
If only.
if you knew someone who was a soy boy, soy jack, what are other internet
Loser.
terms?
Incel?
Instead of being a based Christian, they're a soy jack incel,
Reddit user?
and they are very much not a Chad. They are, in fact, a Discord mod.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That one's bad.
And they have beef with Christianity, and they say something like, the Gospels are unreliable because they were written decades. Jesse, if we could get like an echo on that. Decades!
Some like hard reverb, some delay.
Decades after the events described, and therefore we can't trust what the Gospels say because they were written so long after Jesus supposedly did anything, and therefore your religion's a sham, and being an atheist who smokes weed all the time and eats Cheetos in their mom's basement is a better way to exist than believing your ancient fairy tales.
What? r/atheism is so cool.
Yeah, everyone there is having such a good time. Anyway, if you hypothetically ran into someone like that, you might think to yourself, geez, were the Gospels written decades after the events described? And then you might try to look into it and find that the answer is,
Maybe?
we're not sure. Because the fact of the matter is, we're not sure exactly when the Gospels were written.
We can take some educated guesses, though.
We can take some educated guesses. And today, what I want to do is for us to make some educated guesses.
Do that.
And before we do that, I want to set the stage. A long time ago, I used to go to church with this guy. And his name was Richard Arnold. And everyone called him Dick.
Oh.
Yeah. He was a nice guy.
Oh. Poor Dick.
Dick was a nice guy. He was a World War II veteran. And he had Alzheimer's. And one day he went for a drive, got confused because he had Alzheimer's, parked his car on the side of the road, walked off into the woods, got lost, and died of hypothermia. So rest empowered. But this man had Alzheimer's, and that's what killed him, ultimately. Well, I mean, the cold killed him, but also the Alzheimer's. If it wasn't for that, he wouldn't have gotten cold and died.
Yeah.
But Mr. Arnold wrote a book. It was published in 2012. This is when he still had his mind pretty good. He died about 2-3 years after that. He wrote a book about his experience in the war. It's called Dig and Dig Deep. There aren't a whole lot of copies about it, but you can still find it out there. He was one of 20 people in his platoon that survived a massacre on the Western Front. He went and fought and killed Nazis. And
rest in power, King.
Yeah, he dug a foxhole, and he dug it as deep as he could, and he survived. He didn't write his book until, we'll say, he starts in 2010, okay? Sure. World War II ends in 1946, 45? 45, 46?
45, I think
it's 45. So, well...
Yeah, because, I know this because of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. His concentration camp that he was killed at was liberated just a couple of weeks after he died, which was after the war ended.
Okay.
So 45, because that's when Bonhoeffer died.
So 45. So 55, 65, 75, 85, 95, 2005. So about 65 years.
Yeah.
65 years after these things happened to Mr. Dick Arnold, who had Alzheimer's, he was still able to write a book about what happened to him 65 years later. So I want you all to take out a pen and paper and write down 65.
Oh, I didn't know I needed those.
Well, you can go grab them.
Don't have paper.
You don't have pen or paper in your entire house.
I've definitely got a pen. I guess I've got my notebook, but that's downstairs. So
anyway, you don't really need to write it down. 65 years. And he was still able to tell an accurate story about things that happened to him when he was a young man. Okay? Now, if our gospel writers write their gospels within 65 years of events described, they're probably accurate.
More than reasonable to assume so.
If that is the case for people who live now, that they can write books 65 years later and have good information, then it was the case then that people could write books 65 years later and have good information.
So, we already laid this out just in the last episode there, but you and I are both in agreement that the events described in the Bible are in fact true.
Yeah.
They are correct.
And I'll go even further, okay? So my grandfather, he was born in the 1930s. I'll say 1935, because I don't want to dox my grandfather, and also, it was in there. So we'll say 1935. The last Civil War veteran died in 1950. So there was something like a 20-odd year period where my grandfather, who is still alive now, could have gotten accurate, true stories about the Civil War from someone who experienced the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather, who's still alive now in the year 2024, could write a story that's accurate and true. 2024 minus what, 1865-ish?
Yeah.
Ish, something like that. Well, we'll say 2025 so that my math is easier. Doing this longhand. 160 years after the Civil War ended, someone could, with 1 degree of removal, write a true and accurate story about things that happened during the Civil War. 160 years later. So if our Gospels are written between 65 for the high end of eyewitness accounts and 160 years for the high end of 1 degree of removal, then they are still probably, in all likelihood, true, accurate, and reliable. Fair? Because if these things are the case now, for people now, that was the case for people then, who were people, just like people now. So let's find out if the Gospels were written between 65 and 160 years, if they were written within that time frame after the events described. And if they are, then we can probably trust what they have to say as not mere hogwash. Sound fair?
Let's do it.
On my paper. On the far end of the timeline, we're going to write down 35. Because that's...
AD, yeah.
Yeah, AD. Generally, when people say, yeah, Jesus was probably crucified somewhere around there, you might get as early as 30 and as late as 36. So we'll just say 35. Keep it nice and round. On the other end, we'll write 200. Okay, 160 plus 35. That would be right around 190 something.
Yeah, right.
As the far end for the Gospels to be.
Just shy of 200.
Yep. As the far end for our Gospels to be written. And we're going to start all the way... We're going to add a couple little points of interest on our timeline. The first one is going to be the year 64 AD. That is when the Great Fire of Rome happens. Nero is the emperor. Rome burns. He plays the fiddle. He blames the Christians for it. And Peter and ostensibly Paul are both martyred in the wake of persecution that follows that.
Yeah.
So, 64 AD, Rome burns. Not long after that, we have 70 AD. Do you know what happened in 70 AD, Ryan?
Not off the top of my head.
The temple is destroyed.
Oh, yeah, that happened.
Yeah, so the Jewish second temple that Jesus went and taught at is destroyed because the Jews had a rebellion against Rome. Rome didn't like that very much, so they tore it to the ground. All right? Our next known date that's going to be relevant is right around the year 120. Around the year 120, Marcion of Sinope, the heretic, is excommunicated from the church.
Like the first heretic. One of, anyway.
Yeah.
That we know about.
Yeah, he's one of the... He's the arch heretic. First one.
We don't like Marcion very much.
Yeah, Marcion can suck an egg.
His biblical canon was bad.
He was bad. So, Marcion, his heresy was thinking that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are different gods. And therefore, not the same. And we should detest the God of the Old Testament and love the God of the New Testament. And everyone was like, what are you talking about? That's nonsense. Our next date of known is 155. You remember what happened in 155?
I probably do, but not off the top of my head.
Our friend Polycarp of Smyrna, Bishop of Smyrna,
Oh, yeah.
and a disciple of John the Beloved, is martyred right around that time.
Yeah, he sure was. In the Roman circus.
Yeah. As was a fellow named Justin Martyr.
Were they martyred in the same year?
They were right around the same time, plus or minus a few.
Okay.
I think technically Polycarp was 157 and Justin Martyr was like 155. But they were very close.
I guess I've just never clicked it like in my head that like they lived at the same time.
They probably knew each other.
Yeah, like that just never clicked to me until now. That's crazy.
I'm pretty sure that Justin Martyr was converted by Polycarp.
Ooh.
I don't have evidence for that, but the story that Justin Martyr tells about his conversion, I could totally see it being Polycarp being the one that converts him.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
But that's neither here nor there.
Yeah.
Our next date of known things is 180. Around 180, Irenaeus of Lyons writes a book called Against Heresies.
That's very important.
Yeah.
For the Christian thing.
It is. Irenaeus of Lyons in Against Heresies has a section where he's very upset Because a young man who was a disciple of Justin Martyr named Tatian has written a document called the Diatessaron. The Diatessaron was an attempt by Tatian to take all four Gospels and harmonize them. He wanted to make one big gospel out of the four.
One perfect gospel.
Yeah, a giga-gospel. Diatessaron means out of the four, or according to four.
I like that giga gospel.
Yeah, he makes the giga-gospel. And Irenaeus of Lyons in 180 says definitively, no, there are four Gospels, and only four.
Yeah.
So in 180, that is well within our 160-year outlier mark for authorship. We definitively have all four Gospels written, and there are definitively four of them.
So you actually missed a bit of history there related to this that I think goes even further back to Marcion.
Well,
Marcion made his own gospel.
We're getting there.
Yeah.
We're getting there.
Tatian was not the first to make his own gospel.
So Tatian is, I think Tatian was a person of goodwill, and he just thought that it would be a cool thing to do.
He was misguided, though.
Yeah, he made a mistake, and as far as I know, once it was brought to his attention that he probably shouldn't be doing that, I believe he ceased and desisted.
Marcion did not do that.
Marcion, much less so. So we'll get to Marcion again in a second. We're going to work our way back from 180. So the Diatessaron is written sometime around 160 or so. It's after Justin Martyr is dead.
Yes.
If Justin Martyr were still alive, he would have said, Tatian, buddy, you don't need to do that.
It's all right, man.
Oh, another brief little blurb of history. So Polycarp of Smyrna, who was made Bishop of Smyrna by John the Beloved,
Yes.
was the bishop and mentor of Irenaeus.
Yes.
Okay? And Irenaeus tells us in his book Against Heresies, which is well within 160 years after Jesus dies, that John the Beloved was still alive when this particular emperor became emperor, whose name I don't remember, but I do remember he became emperor in the year 98.
So John is still alive circa 98.
Yep. John's still kicking in 98.
Now, what we're not sure of is John on Patmos by 98, or is he still around doing his thing before he's exiled?
I don't know.
Less sure.
Irenaeus doesn't really specify. He just says
he is alive.
He says that John is still alive when
Yeah.
X guy becomes emperor. You could look up who was emperor in 98, and that would tell us which emperor, but I don't remember which one. So then, 180, we definitely have all four Gospels. 160, when Tatian writes the Diatessaron, we definitely have all four Gospels.
Trajan.
Thank you.
Emperor Trajan.
So John is still alive when Trajan becomes the emperor, who was not a fan of the church.
Yeah, so he becomes emperor in 98, and his reign ends in 117.
There you go. Now, Marcion of Sinope, well, there's so much to say, Ryan.
There is.
There's so much to say.
You've got so much time left, though.
I'm so excited. Our friend Polycarp of Smyrna, around the year 110, goes on a road trip with his buddy Papias.
Yeah, he does that.
Papias and Polycarp, I'm assuming probably because they get the news that John has died.
Yeah.
This is probably what spurs this on. They get the news John has died. They look at each other. They realize they're getting older because they're middle-aged. And they say, we're not going to last for forever. And people like us that knew the apostles aren't going to last for forever. We need to go and collect their stories. So they do. They go out and they travel all around the ancient world, and they collect stories from people who knew the apostles and who had stories about them, essentially. They talked with the daughters of Philip, and they got some information from them. They talked to people in Rome and so on and so forth. So
The guys who knew Paul and...
the guys who knew Paul, they went around and got all this great stuff. Unfortunately, we don't have all of what Papias and Polycarp produced.
Unfortunately, that's so sad.
We have very, very little. But around 110, they do that.
And we still have a little bit of it.
And we have a little bit from them. And what we do have is good and helpful, and we will be referencing it momentarily.
All right. Thanks,
So-
Papias and Polycarp.
A tradition, while they are in Rome, Marcion of Sinope, who's excommunicated around 120,
I love this story. I love this.
he sees Polycarp. And he's a fan of Polycarp, and he's kind of been making waves with his nonsense. And he's excited to go and talk to someone, and he thinks he has a reputation, and maybe Polycarp will be excited to talk to him. So he approaches Polycarp, and he says, "Hey, do you know who I am?" And Polycarp looks at him and says, "You are the firstborn of Satan."
It's so good.
Yeah. So Marcion, around that time, has decided that because the God of the Old Testament is bad and the God of the New Testament is good, he's going to make his own version of the scriptures.
And he does that.
And he does that. So what he does is takes some of what Paul has written that he likes, but he edits it down so that he likes it more. And he takes the Gospel of Luke specifically.
Yeah, so if I'm not mistaken, I want to say it's 7 of Paul's writings, I think, and the Gospel of Luke, specifically.
Which he edits.
Which he edits a lot.
But
Not even just a little bit. He severely edits Luke's Gospel, and then changes the name to the Gospel of Marcion.
yeah, he changes it significantly. Now, what does that tell us about when, for sure, Luke is written by?
By the time Marcion has written the Gospel of Marcion, at least.
So, around 110, we've definitely got Luke.
Yeah.
Which is still well within people who knew the disciples' lifetimes.
Yeah.
But it's going to get even better. Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's all coming together.
Biblical scholars almost universally agree that Mark was written first, because there are large narrative chunks in Matthew and Luke that seem to be direct quotations from Mark. There are also teachings in Matthew and Luke that have a lot of overlap. And so biblical scholars have a theory that Matthew and Luke were writing right around the same time, that they were both using Mark as a kind of a skeleton for what they write, and that they both had access to a collection of sayings from Jesus. This hypothetical collections of sayings is called Q. There's only one problem with Q, and that's that we have no manuscript tradition of it existing. It is a hypothetical. It might exist, maybe, but as far as we can tell for now, maybe not. But we can say that Mark was almost definitively written before Matthew and Luke, and Matthew and Luke appear to have been written very similarly in time to each other. We have a bit of a logic puzzle here. If we figure out when Matthew or when Luke was written, we have an approximate date for the other. And if we will necessarily know that Mark predates them. Okay? You follow?
Yeah.
So in the year 70, the temple's destroyed, as we established. In the year 64 to 65, Peter and Paul are martyred after the Great Fire of Rome. Okay? Now, after that happens, there's a problem in Corinth. And the problem is that the church there Some of the people are upset with their leaders, so they kick them out, and they say, we don't want you being our bishops anymore. So a fellow in Rome, whose name is Clement, who is one of the leaders there at the church in Rome, writes the Corinthian church a letter, and he asks them to reinstate their leaders and quit being jerkheads.
Yeah, he does do that.
So we're not exactly sure when Clement writes his thing. Some scholars will put it as late as like the 90s or even into the early hundreds. But I'm going to make the argument, and other scholars might agree with me on this, that it was written prior to the year 70. And I'm going to make that argument for two reasons. Firstly, there is internal evidence in Clement's first epistle to
Corinth.
Clement of Rome's first epistle to the church in Corinth. There is internal evidence that supports that he knows about all of the scriptural traditions. Okay? So he's familiar with the writings of Peter. He's familiar with the writings of Paul. He seems to be familiar with the book of Hebrews. Except he is not familiar with the Joannean literature. That's the stuff by John. Clement seems to be writing before John writes his epistles, his gospel, or the book of Revelation. And there's a curious section here.
There is.
Where Clement says, the continual daily sacrifices, peace offerings, sin offerings, and trespass offerings are by no means offered in every place, brothers, but at an altar in front of the temple, and then only after a careful scrutiny of the offering by the high priest and the other ministers aforesaid. It seems to be the case that Clement is referring to the temple in the present tense.
Yeah.
He seems to be under the impression that offerings in the temple are taking place currently.
And if anyone would know, he would.
Yeah, I mean, he's in Rome, so it's possible that the temple was destroyed and he hasn't had news of it yet.
That's unlikely.
I mean, there could be like a lapse of 6 months for the news to travel. But Clement's probably writing his epistle a little before 70.
Yeah.
He also mentions the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul, so a little bit after 64. So we'll say Clement's writing, just for easy numbers, 68. Split the difference. And that's before John has written his stuff. Keep in mind, John is alive until 98. John has, on the low end, 98. It could have been even longer. But John has about 30 years left before we start anticipating his death.
Yeah.
He's got plenty of time to write stuff. But Clement seems to be well aware of Matthew, Mark, and Luke based off of internal evidence and what he writes. Now, let's go to the Gospels themselves real quick. Well, slightly beyond the Gospels. We're going to go to the book of Acts, because you may not know this, but Luke and Acts were written by the same guy. We put John right in the middle of them, but Luke is volume 1 and Acts is volume 2, a companion set.
Yeah.
And Luke is the story of Jesus and the stuff Jesus does. And then Acts is the story of the early church, and then Paul and what Paul is getting up to. And for the second half of Acts, we mostly just follow Paul. And it's apparent from internal evidence that Luke, our author, is hanging out with Paul through a lot of this stuff.
Yes.
There's at one point where there's a shift in the pronoun usage, where instead of it being he about Paul, it becomes we, because Luke is ostensibly with Paul going through the stuff. So we get to the end of Acts. Paul gives his speech to Felix, and he preaches some stuff, and he says some stuff, and this is how Luke ends the book of Acts. He lived there, that's Paul, 2 whole years at his own expense, and welcomed all who came to him, proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. What do we notice about the ending of Acts?
What do we notice?
Well, Paul doesn't die.
No, he doesn't.
In fact, Luke kind of takes us right up to the execution block and then stops.
Yeah.
Paul is still imprisoned in Rome when it ends. He's preaching and not being hindered by the guard or anything. He's doing his thing. But he doesn't die.
And I know where you're going with this.
Where am I going with it, Ryan?
There are some extra biblical texts that we have that suggest Paul did not die after the events of Acts, but continued his journey to the west, all the way to the edge of the sea.
It's true. If we go back to Clement of Rome, Clement tells us he, being Paul, preached in the east and in the west, winning a noble reputation for his faith. He taught righteousness to all the world, and after reaching the furthest limits of the west, which is the Straits of Gibraltar, which is in Spain, which if you go to the book of Romans, Paul mentions that after he goes to Rome, he wants to travel to Spain.
Yep.
After reaching the furthest limits of the west and bearing his testimony before kings and rulers, he passed out of this world and was received into the holy places.
So he did not die in Acts, perhaps.
So he's not dead at the end of Acts. Well, if he was, do you think Luke wouldn't have mentioned it?
That sure would be odd, not only for Luke to exclude, that sure would be odd for Clement to be talking about this if it's not true, considering he knew the guy.
Yeah, and there's lots of stuff going on in Luke and Acts where it seems like he's almost drawing parallels between Jesus and Paul. I think Luke wants us to see these parallels here. And Jesus, the climax of his story, is the crucifixion. That's the crescendo, right?
Yeah.
So then we have Paul, and we've got all these parallels going on, and it's like, okay, yeah, we've got these parallels. I see what's going on here. He's going to talk to Felix, and he's going to have a crescendo, and then he doesn't.
It just ends abruptly.
Which tells me that it seems likely that Paul is still alive. Luke in Acts doesn't tell us anything about Peter's death either. It doesn't have to be Paul who has the crescendo at the end of the thing.
Yeah.
To finish out the parallel. He could have had it be Peter, and it would have been perfect. Peter is crucified too, just like his Lord. It's perfect. It's narratively as tidy as it could be, except Luke doesn't do that because it hasn't happened yet, which tells us that Luke Acts is compiled prior to 64 AD, when the Great Fire of Rome happens, which results in part in the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul.
Yeah.
So, Luke Acts, we'll say 60.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't mention Paul going out to Spain.
He does not.
But Clement does. So if Paul went out to Spain after 2 years of living in Rome, which Luke does tell us about, then Luke would have mentioned it. Wouldn't he have?
Yeah, probably.
But he doesn't. He doesn't have any other stories about Paul going out to Spain. But Clement does. So, we'll say 60. Paul finishes being imprisoned in 60. He hangs out for a little while. He goes out to the Straits of Gibraltar, preaches the gospel there, and then 64 happens and he is executed. There we go. That seems reasonable.
It does.
A reasonable timeline. So we can just, on our piece of paper that we have where we've got our timeline, right around 60, we can put Luke, Acts, because they're volume 1 and 2, and then Matthew, because biblical scholars would agree that Matthew and Luke were written right around the same time. Which means Matthew's written right around 60. Now, because Luke is travel companions and good friends with Paul, it would be fair to say, on some level, that the Gospel of Luke while it is not an eyewitness account, because Luke is not there, in some ways, I believe it to be the Gospel according to Paul. It's most likely, as I understand it, that Luke is taking the stories of the Gospel that he has heard Paul preach as they go throughout, and he has written them down. In part, making an effort to set up an orderly account, using different sources that he has access to, and talking to people that they meet along their travels, like John Mark and Peter himself, and so on, because they're encountering these other people. That's where that gospel comes from. So the angry atheist might say, well, it's not an eyewitness account. Well, no, but neither would my grandfather's Civil War memoir be an eyewitness account, but that doesn't mean that it would be inaccurate. Matthew, however, is an eyewitness account, and it was written almost exactly around the same time. And that's not nothing.
Yeah.
Now, Mark, our first gospel, was written by John Mark, who we meet in the book of Acts.
That's crazy.
But what's the deal with John Mark? How does John Mark get the ability to write the gospel? Where the heck did this guy come from? Earlier, I talked about a guy named Papias.
Did.
Yeah.
We like Papias.
We do like Papias. And Papias gives us some information about Mark.
Yeah.
So, if I may quote Papias, a tradition regarding Mark, who wrote the gospel, which he, Papias, has given in the following words. And the presbyter said this. So this is when Papias and Polycarp go on their road trip to meet someone who knew the author, Mark, and they told them this thing. So this is 1 degree removed from Mark himself. Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, so John Mark is a Greek fellow, Peter is a Jewish fellow. As they're going around traveling together, Mark is translating for Peter. Okay? That's what he tells us. Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatsoever he remembered. It was not, however, in exact order, and he related the sayings or deeds of Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. Mark himself was not there. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's saying. Wherefore, Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them. For of one thing he took especial care, not to omit anything he had heard, and not to put anything fictitious into the statements. So Mark, who's the interpreter and companion of Peter would tell stories about Jesus, and Mark wrote some of those stories down as best he could remember them, and that's where the Gospel of Mark comes from. So the Gospel of Mark is the Gospel according to Peter, as told by Mark, and Peter is in fact an eyewitness, which means that it has to be before Peter dies.
Yeah.
Which means it has to be before 64, and Matthew and Luke are well familiar with it.
Yeah, they are.
Which means that it has to be a good chunk before 60 for Luke in the area of Rome to have access to copies of it, and Matthew somewhere back in Jerusalem to have copies of it. So we could probably say Mark was written sometime around, 55?
That sounds about right.
So Mark is the gospel according to Peter as told by Mark, which is 1 degree removed from eyewitness. Luke is the gospel according to Paul and others, probably Barnabas and so on, other travel companions that he and Luke shared, who were eyewitnesses. Again, 1 degree removed. Matthew, told by Matthew, who is an eyewitness, and John, told by John,
who was an eyewitness.
Was an eyewitness.
Yeah.
So all of our information from the Gospels are coming from either very, very close associates who knew eyewitnesses personally or eyewitnesses themselves. And all of our Gospels will say John writes his in 98, push it all the way to the end, the most liberal possible authorship date. It's within 70 years. What range did we have earlier? 65 to 160?
To 160, yeah.
If we could get them all within that amount of time frame, then they're probably accurate. And by golly,
might I be able to further bolster your argument with stuff you didn't even have prepped?
Yeah, hit me with it, bro.
At least I don't think you did. Is that like the last of your stuff?
I mean, I could pontificate for hours on this, but hit me with what you got.
I will argue the book of James, my personal favorite book of scripture, further bolsters the idea that these are reliable. So, we talked about in the book of James episode that we did, how the book of James, the letter of James, whatever you want to call it, was at least in part probably written in response to the martyrdom of Stephen. We know that Stephen was martyred at the latest by the year 34 or 35 AD.
Okay.
Right around Jesus' death.
Mm-hmm.
Thereabouts, okay? Book of James was probably written partly in response to that act.
Mm-hmm.
So we know it was written after 34 or 35 AD almost certainly. We know for a fact that James himself was martyred in the year 44 AD.
Mm-hmm.
So by the year 44, James is definitively dead. Acts tells us this.
Okay.
That tells us the letter or book of James was written between the years 34 and 44 AD. Definitive. It was written in that time frame. Now, while the book of James is not a gospel, he does say a lot of stuff in there that is directly reflected in the Gospels. Certain truths, certain things that Jesus apparently said. By the year 44, the latest.
Could be evidence for Q.
So at the absolute latest, by the year 44 AD, James is writing down truths and things about Jesus that are supposedly the case. And those same truths are reflected almost exactly in the Gospels. So it appears to be the case to me, the authors of the Gospels are probably familiar with this letter by James.
Probably so.
Because it's really friggin' early.
Yeah.
And if we're seeing the same truths reflected in the Gospels that we are in James, that's telling me it's pretty darn reliable. I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. So, when you go to the internet or anywhere else in life, and you encounter the atheist who's like, well, the Gospels were written decades after what happened. It's like, well, okay, in the case of Mark, 20 years? Can you not get accurate information about what happened in 2004?
If you were alive in 2004 and you're still alive today, can you not recount things that happened in 2004?
Can someone in 2010 who has Alzheimer's not tell accurate stories about World War II? The answer is, of course he can tell accurate stories about World War II. He wrote a book about it. I told you the name of it. You can go look it up. He actually had a historian verify the information, so it's like vetted by an actual World War II historian who like went through Mr. Arnold's memoir, and he was like, yep, that battle for sure happened here, and that...
Yep.
So it's true. It's accurate. A fellow with Alzheimer's 65 years after can tell accurate stories about the thing. Someone with a good head on their shoulders 65 years, 70 years after the events described in the Gospels could absolutely talk about it. It's stupid to think they couldn't.
And if James is on board with these same truths about what happened before the Gospels are even written, that seems like pretty accurate information to me, probably. That seems more than reasonable.
And, not to mention, if you talk to that atheist fellow, they might say things like, actually, the Bible was written by straight white rich men to just subjugate people so that way they could have power, and that's why it's the blah, 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 blah. Well,
They weren't white, brother.
yeah. Also, writing the Gospels didn't do any of them any favors.
No.
Yeah, John, he dies an old man exiled in a prison colony that was a mine.
And that's the happiest death we get from the disciples.
Yeah. Peter crucified upside down, Bartholomew skinned alive, etc., etc., etc. Couple were boiled in oil. It's just...
James was murdered,
Yeah.
Stephen, the first martyr, wasn't even a disciple, and he was stoned to death.
Yeah. Well, he wasn't one of the 12, but he probably knew Jesus.
If not Jesus, we know for a fact he knew some of the disciples, at least, so...
Yeah, it seems to be that he knew Jesus.
Yeah, and he was stoned to death. That's not a fun way to go, man.
No, it's not. There are several narrative traditions about the martyrdom of James, and Eusebius kind of synthesizes all of them.
Yeah.
And it seems to be the case with the Eusebius's synthesis that James was thrown from the pinnacle of the temple, stabbed, and stoned to death. So he got, triple dead.
And he was the first disciple to be martyred.
Yeah, so they weren't getting power, they weren't getting money, they weren't getting women through this thing. It was making their lives harder,
actively miserable,
maybe even worse. But they did it anyway because it was the right thing to do. Well, I see no reason to beleaguer this and torture it out.
Yeah,
I said my piece. I was mostly kicking it from the head.
Yeah,
so I think I did pretty good for just pulling it off the dome. But I think that the Gospels can be pretty reliably shown from extra-biblical documentation to have been written probably within all of them. I wouldn't say that the Gospel of John was written in 98. I'd say it's probably a couple years earlier than that, maybe 90. So all of them, for sure, are well within 60 years. The first three are within 30 years. If you can't figure out what happened in 1994 accurately now, then we have a problem.
Yeah, and
you're surrounded by people with dementia. Go find someone whose brain works.
Yeah, and again, James's epistle is definitively written by 44. Within 40 years of Jesus being born, not even dead.
Yeah,
that's within a decade.
Less than 10 years of Jesus' death, yeah.
And I get that one's not a gospel, obviously, but it is an epistle. That's within a decade.
Necessarily, all of Paul's stuff is written before Paul is dead and before Acts. So Paul is writing all of his stuff throughout the 50s. So within 20-something, 30 years of Jesus, which means that if Paul is full of malarkey, if Paul's just saying stuff that makes no sense, we would have people who knew Jesus being like, what is Paul talking about? I knew Jesus myself, and he was just some guy, but we don't get that.
Because it's true.
So, there you go. So I hope this was helpful for you. I hope it was proves to be a good resource in the future. And if you have any questions or comments for us, please feel free to email us at theology-ish@gmail.com. And don't forget, like, comment, subscribe, leave a 5-star review, share this with a friend, and so forth. And we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening.
Have a good one.